Welcome to practices for addressing disproportionality in SLD. On behalf of the Department of Education, I see Kristen on the line here. So Kristen, I'm happy for you to unmute and offer a welcome if you'd like. But on behalf of the DOE, I just want to welcome you to the discussion today. This is the second in a series of webinars that we're offering as part of the department's collaboration with the IDRC. And the IDRC is a collaborative effort between the Equity Project at Indiana University, the Rowan Corporation, and Virtuoso Education Consulting. My name is Renee Aziz, and I'm the Director of Professional Development for Virtuoso, and we're leading the technical assistance work that we're providing to corporations in need of support. This is one of our areas of support. So again, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your time. And I see that we have Southwest Allen on the line. So hi, Roxanne and crew. Before I go to you, Kristen, did you want to say anything? You can chat it or you can unmute. Thanks, Kristen. So I have quite a full agenda planned for the next 90 minutes. Today we will begin our conversation with an overview of Article 7 as it relates to the identification of SLD. We'll then discuss some specific practices for addressing disproportionality in SLD, and these include things like monitoring the effectiveness of the RTI process, assessing the influence of exclusionary factors on SLD, and supporting move-in students, which is always a hot topic in the area of disproportionality. We'll end our webinar today with some information about your next steps on this journey. And I want to let you know that as we go along, I have some planned opportunities for you to engage in some activities and reflections. So at each of those points, I really want you to be thoughtful about taking the time and really responding to the questions that I have posted and talk about those as a team. So speaking of teams, let's find out who is joining us today. So by that, I mean, let me know in the chat box the roles of the people that you've got joining you on this call. Again, just let us know the kinds of folks that you've invited to engage in this conversation with you today. Go ahead and post that in the chat.
Very small.
Can she hear us?
Roxanne for sharing who is joining you today. So in full transparency, I know you well, Roxanne, and have supported you on this journey across time. So hopefully this information will still be useful to you, and I welcome whatever site that you have joining you today. So as we move forward in the conversation, I again want to start our conversation by highlighting what Article 7 says with regard to specific learning disabilities. So to do that, let's start by highlighting the required evaluation components. So we must always ensure that we provide parents with written notice of evaluation and, of course, obtain parental consent, right? That's a given. We have to do that prior to the beginning of any evaluation. So there's infrequently any issues around that, but it's still important to state that we must ensure that these criteria are met when we begin an evaluation process. And particularly, this reminder is important when our evaluation flows from other processes in our schools and districts, for example, the RTI process. Sometimes we neglect to consider that we still need to obtain those levels of consent, even though the process in which we're servicing kids is a natural flow of what we do for everyone. Extending that conversation specific to SLD, Article 7 states that our evaluations need to include an assessment of a student's current levels of academic achievement, an observation of the student in the general ed setting. We need to have information about educationally relevant medical information, a social developmental history, and then we need to do our assessment of the student's academic process and really analyze any interventions that we've provided. And finally, we should also be collecting any additional assessments that are needed to address exclusionary factors, which we'll talk about today. We need to do that in order to determine eligibility in the area of SLD. Sometimes we can't determine eligibility because we have to consider that exclusionary factors are actually impacting a student. But nevertheless, collecting that additional assessment information can inform the development of an IEP if it comes to that level. Additionally, there are 5 components that we must address in our SLD evaluation. So I want to just take a look at each of those components specifically, starting with the first, this concept of underachievement. So the presence of underachievement is a requirement for eligibility. The interesting point about this, from my perspective, is that Article 7 provides a definition of achievement, and that reads something like, achievement refers to a student's performance in relation to the continuum of Indiana academic standards. This might include performance on norm reference tests or criterion reference tests and any other achievement, really. So it's telling us again that when we're thinking about achievement, we're thinking about the student's performance as it relates to academic standards. What's interesting to me, as I was saying, is that Article 7 does not provide a definition of underachievement. What we commonly think of as underachievement is that a student is not achieving as expected for his or her age or is not meeting grade level standards. Additionally, in the area of SLD, we've got to be specific about the areas in which we're looking for underachievement. So for SLD, as you can see here on the slide, we're really having to consider the scope of underachievement in the areas of oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math calculation, and math problem solving. So the important thing that I want you to capture from this slide is that you've got to quantify what underachievement means. So think about how you will quantify the scores or the percentiles that are going to be indicative of underachievement in your school or district. What assessments will you use to measure underachievement? And how recent must those assessments be? Those are some components that sometimes we take for granted as we're fulfilling that requirement of Article 7. So those decisions, we've got to take those into consideration and think about the alignment between the data that highlights achievement levels and the specific areas that we're interested in exploring on behalf of the student related to SLD. Think about also, what are you going to do if there's mixed evidence, right? So what if you identify assessments and you quantify those things, and there are some assessments that yield data that suggest there is underachievement and others that don't give that impression? Those are all components that you all need to be thinking about defining very explicitly as you fulfill that component of your SLD evaluation process. Moving on to the second area or component that we need for evaluation, according to Article 7, is the evidence of SLD. Right, this is the component that most people think of as the primary thing that we're assessing as it relates to SLD. According to Article 7, SLD can be evidenced through insufficient progress when using a process that's based on the student's response to scientific research-based interventions, or we can identify SLD through a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, or what we call PSW, in performance and achievement, or both. And those strengths and weaknesses can be relative to age or grade level standards, or even intellectual development. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you all are using the insufficient progress approach, you should be certain that the interventions provided address the specific area of need, and that there's strong documentation that the interventions were implemented with fidelity. Additionally, you'll want to ensure that progress monitoring data is collected appropriately through normative comparisons around what the student's rate of improvement is around those interventions. I just want to offer that if those components are not fully in place, using a PSW approach might be the more appropriate option for identifying SLD. But again, Article 7 says that you can determine SLD through either option. The third component that I want to talk to you about are the two sets of exclusionary factors that must be addressed as part of the evaluation. So the first set of factors pertain to a student's language proficiency or their culture, as well as the presence of additional disabilities other than SLD. Because those initial factors, those of disability, culture, environment, and limited English proficiency, I think that those often come up as an area of noncompliance in the file review process in my experience. So I'm going to talk about those in more detail shortly, but here I'm just highlighting for you that they are one of the components of SLD evaluation. And again, we'll circle back around to it here in a minute. Moving to the fourth component, the evaluation must also ensure that the student, the source of the underachievement is not lack of appropriate instruction. So Article 7 requires that this exclusionary factor be ruled out as a primary cause for the student's learning disability, or learning difficulty, I should say. So the clause in Article 7 states that the lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math is evidenced by data demonstrating that appropriate instruction was provided, that there have been repeated assessments at various intervals. So as a team, you all should develop specific criteria or procedures or even protocols for documenting how you can be sure that appropriate instruction has been provided to the student. I suggest that developing those criteria or procedures is important so that you have consistency in your practices at the district and building levels. Another point about that exclusionary factor, this concept of measuring appropriate instruction, this component can be addressed by completing observations of teachers' delivery of instruction, and that sometimes happens through routine classroom visits that administrators are doing, or even more formal observations that you're conducting because of this referral. But I've also seen checklists utilized as a measure of the implementation of instruction. So these checklists can be self-ratings, peer ratings, or even checklists that are completed by additional staff members like coaches that work with classroom teachers. All I'm saying here is that it's important to explicitly address this factor in the evaluation. It's often the case that this component is not adequately addressed. As I'm coaching, providing some support to my colleagues in the school psych field, this is something that we can be more intentional about noting in our evaluation summaries. Finally, as is the case with all eligibility areas, the evaluation must also indicate that whether or not the suspected disability adversely affects the student's educational performance. So in this regard, we are really thinking about or taking into account the ways in which the disability is impacting the student's performance, whether that be their academic or functional performance. Just going to pause there and check out the conversation box here. Let me know if you have questions. Seeing none, I'm just going to move on then to evaluation reports. Article 7 also provides us some guidance about how we should disseminate the results once our evaluations are completed. When summarizing the data, our report should be really a synthesis of our findings. We should have a summary of the important components that we've reviewed in the evaluation process pertaining to academic underachievement, pertaining to any data that's related to indicators of SLD as determined either through our RTI or our strengths and weaknesses approach, and again, consideration of exclusionary factors. Additionally, the evaluation report must include that certification, the SLD certification form that identifies or captures the opinion of each member of the multidisciplinary team regarding SLD eligibility. So I put up a little snapshot of a template that you can use. Again, Article 7 doesn't mandate what this looks like, but again, the important part that you should be aware of is that the checklist captures the essential components of an SLD evaluation, and then at the bottom, as seen here, it's explicitly seeking the opinion of all team members. Again, no required format, but those components must be included in whatever you are using. So again, we're focusing here on whether or not we assess inadequate achievement, progress, those exclusionary factors, and the adverse effects. Also, at the last bullet point here, for students who have participated in an RTI process, I kind of mentioned this as I was showing the certification form, but for any time we're using that insufficient progress approach, we must also make sure that our evaluations document that we have provided the notification to parents regarding the provision of those interventions. We've got to provide information about what strategies we use as a part of that process and provide a summary of the assessment data we've collected. So I'm just going to give an opportunity to pause here. Given that Roxanne, it looks like still our only district on the line, we might not have to take a full 10 minutes. But I do want you, Roxanne, and school psychologist colleagues to talk about just those components of SLD. So think about in Southwest Allen, if those components are explicitly defined, think about what approaches you're using right now to identify students with specific learning disabilities, whether or not you're using that insufficient progress approach or the PSW approach or both. And if you're using both, then when do you discern which is the best approach to use for the particular student? And then I want you to take some time to think about whether or not you have written procedures. And I don't mean this as a yes, we do or no, we don't. But think about if you don't have written procedures, kind of what stakeholders you need to help you build these. And if you do, think about how you can make sure that you can monitor the fidelity in which those procedures are implemented, right? We all know just because we have something written down doesn't mean everyone across the district is really following those approaches. So how can you monitor that? And think about also what we mentioned around evaluation reports. How do your current reports, how do you make sure that your current evaluation report templates or process aligns with Article 7 expectations? So I'll set my timer here for 7 minutes, and then I'll check in with you to see if you need more time to reflect on your practices around that area. Roxanne and team, and I provided my answers. So regarding whether or not the checklist or this, I should have said certification actually needs to be given to parents. My interpretation of Article 7 is that it doesn't require that the certification be given to parents, just that it be included in the synthesis. And then regarding your second question, you know, we used to do our evaluations and our reports would only have the psych's name, but as you identified now, we're doing lots of, we're doing that synthesized report because of, you know, the technology that we're using now. And so I am really suggesting that we have all signatures on that. And absolutely, you know, part of the case conference, so I see your follow-up question, part of that case conference is, you know, making sure that signatures are on there. And I mean, I wouldn't be timid about saying, you know, part of our process is that we certify where we all stand here, and so that's what we're doing now. So I think you know the audience that you're dealing with, but you know, I certainly would feel open to sharing with parents that that's what you all are doing. I don't think that anything in that process should really be secretive in nature. So I think if it's a natural progression, you're passing a paper around, you can say, here now, we're all just certifying, we're providing our reflections or interpretation of based on this, the data that we've collected, whether or not we agree that the student, or what our thoughts are around whether or not the student is eligible. Hopefully, I imagine you would know what your MDT members are going to be saying on there, so there are not any surprises. I think if you haven't had conversations about kind of where you all are thinking, then maybe that's not something you want to specifically bring up in conversation with a parent in detail. But again, hopefully you will know where you all stand related to that. Good questions. Welcome to, I see we had some folks join us, so welcome. And I put the link there to where you can download material for our session. You are just in time to dig into our second section of content that we'll be reviewing this morning. And just before I move on to talk about best practices, I do want to point out also that in the box folder that's located at that link, that I've posted. I've also included a resource guide that was developed by my friend and colleague Leah Nellis and crew when they were running the Effective Evaluation Resource Center. They put together a great SLD considerations guide that I've put there for you that talks about all of the specific components that are required for SLD evaluations, and even presents some frequently asked questions. It even covers the certification checklist as well. So that might be a good resource to make sure everyone understands and is on the same page regarding those things. All right, so as we push forward this morning, I want to shift our attention to some concepts that I'm describing as best practices for addressing disproportionality in SLD. And here I really want to focus on 3 specific practices that are important for you all to consider as you identify strategies for remediating this area of noncompliance. So the first area that I want to talk about is focus on the effectiveness of your RTI process. This is particularly important if you're using the RTI process as a part of your procedures for determining SLD eligibility. The pre-referral intervention or RTI process is designed to develop interventions for students that are experiencing academic or behavioral, even social difficulties in the classroom. And I don't know if this will surprise you, but when we look at the data on this process, the data actually indicates that disproportionality often begins at this stage. By that, what I mean is, we're looking at data, and the data indicates that students referred for interventions in this RTI process actually don't mirror the overall demographics of a district or a specific school's composition or enrollment composition. So I'm going to encourage you to take some time to explore whether or not this is the case in your school or district. So in order to do that, you're going to need to analyze the data for students referred for the RTI process, and then analyze that data to determine if the data is consistent with the percentages of students that appear in your enrollment numbers. The purpose of doing that is that this data really could lead you to revise your practices and your procedures around referral to the process. And although I think that's a really important thing to do, because again, it adds to your understanding of the effectiveness of your process, I think we need to be aware of those trends. But disproportionality at the referral stage can be addressed, or may not lead us down the road of noncompliance if we have an effective process. So if the RTI process is functioning as it's intended to function, then what should we see? We should see that the majority of children referred to the process would be served effectively, right? So interventions would be generated by the intervention team, and as a result, there would only be a small percentage of children that would be kind of moved on to that next level, which would be assessment for eligibility for special education services. So what I'm saying here is that an efficient pre-referral intervention process should show a low percentage of students entering the process who are subsequently assessed for eligibility for special education services. We should also see a high percentage of those students who are referred on for evaluation. We should see a tight alignment between those referred for evaluation and those that qualify. Those are indicators of an effective process. So the referral to, we call that, this process that I've just described is usually referred to as the referral to eligibility ratio. So the referral to eligibility ratio allows for us to examine where disproportionality might be happening in the stages of the process itself. So we can begin by looking at trends in the referral to intervention process, right? So who is referring kids and what kids are being referred to the process in general. And then we can look at trends in the referral to testing part of the process. And then finally, we can observe trends related to disproportionality in special education decision making. So all three kind of phases of that provide us information on whether or not disproportionality is occurring at the first step or two steps in the process or all steps of the process. So examining that data for disproportionality will help you determine if all groups are being served equally throughout the referral to eligibility process. That's an important point for me. I have observed and supported many districts and schools that have great procedures written, a fabulous RTI process in theory, but only certain kids are benefiting from that. And so looking at the data on that process is important to take you to next steps in conversations about how to make sure that that process is what you need it to be. Why is that important? Well, that's important, again, especially if you're using this process as part of your process for determining SLD eligibility. Now, what I've flashed up now on the screen is what I refer to as a team accomplishment tracking form, and this goes way back for me. I not only used this when I was practicing as a school psychologist, but I also trained hundreds of schools and districts to use this kind of form in their RTI processes when I was training that at the state level. So this example of a tracking form is what an RTI team might use to monitor the effectiveness of their RTI process. So here you can see that we're capturing gender differences that come to our team, ethnic differences, grade levels, the area of concern that we're addressing in the process, the assessment tools that we're using, and then here's the piece about the referral to eligibility ratio. We've got the total number of students referred to the process, and that could be total internal referrals, right, made by school staff, versus the number of parent referrals, and then comparing those things to the number of students found eligible or those who are not found eligible. So again, those are pieces that, again, will help you figure out if there's any part of your process that might be fractured. So this form, in addition to a more detailed version, are available in that resource folder on Box. The additional document that I provided is kind of legal size paper, and you can sort out by individual student. You can track trends by an individual student. So it's really your preference, or you can create your own. The takeaway for me is that you need to be tracking the data and analyzing it on an ongoing basis. So as you analyze that data related to effectiveness of the RTI process, that last bullet here talks about disparate outcomes. If you notice that actually our RTI systems are not benefiting all students equally, then that might indicate a need for you to consider culturally relevant instructional practices. So teams should consider if the strategies that they're using are relevant to the interest and background of the students. So this requires that staff be knowledgeable about the influence of culture on learning and behavior. And so while we might rely on evidence-based interventions, the ways in which we deliver those interventions must be culturally relevant to the student. Additionally, I think that differential outcomes that might be identified in the data could also provide you an opportunity to consider the influence on bias on your decision making. So you might start to think about how might we be unintentionally evaluating progress or the lack thereof in different ways. And although none of us want to think that we might have biased lenses, if the data suggests that all students aren't benefiting equally, that's at least at a minimum an area that we must explore. So all of those are important questions for you to consider as you ensure that your RTI process is effective. And I can't reiterate this statement enough. If the process is fractured in any way, then you should be really cautious about using that approach to identify the presence of SLD. Any questions before I move on? I'm going to start talking about a different topic. So I want to address any questions you have about the RTI process specifically. We'll have some time for reflection, but if there are any burning questions, you can type them into the conversation box. All right, so let's move on to that second area that I want to talk to you about today, and that is assessing the influence of exclusionary factors. So I talked about this early on when we were reviewing what Article 7 says about the components of SLD evaluations, and I told you then that I was going to circle back around to this component of exclusionary factors. So Article 7 requires that 9 factors be ruled out as the primary cause for a student's learning difficulties, and they include all those things that you see here: visual, hearing, and motor disabilities, cognitive disabilities, emotional disabilities. In my experience working with my school psych colleagues, we know how to do that well, right? So we utilize all the data from our vision and hearing screenings, and we give fine motor tests, and of course we're looking at data around cognitive impairments and using data around discipline referrals and behaviors that we see in the classroom to help us discern those first 3 bullets. I want to spend some time exploring the last 3 bullets in more detail because I often find that teams have more difficulty identifying effective approaches for capturing the impact of these factors. So these factors include cultural factors, environmental and economic disadvantage, and limited English proficiency. So just in full transparency, as I reflect back to my personal experiences working as a school psychologist, I don't think that I really took the time to fully consider these factors. And it wasn't because I didn't want to. Rather, if there wasn't evidence of those things, then I didn't go looking for evidence of those things being factors. So I'm also not sure that I had the knowledge or the tools that I needed to assess the factors themselves. So as I'm still working with my school psych colleagues, I hear many of them echoing what my experience was and sharing that same concern. So I want us to, again, think about these factors together. Let's start with taking a look at cultural factors. Students may display academic difficulties that are related to their acculturation, meaning their experience with becoming aware of cultural practices in the United States. These difficulties represent differences in levels of performance, but it's just performance. They're not inherent cognitive deficiencies or deficits. So I feel like it's critical that teams have the skills to weigh the relative impact that these cultural issues might have on a student's performance, while at the same time not overlooking the possible indications of special education eligibility. And this is a tough one, this concept of difference versus deficit. Sometimes when we think about cultures and the sense of acculturation, we lose sight, or we don't have enough knowledge to really understand that I might have difficulty becoming assimilated or acculturated to the environment of my school or my community, even if I've lived there all my life. It doesn't mean that I have to be coming from a whole nother country. But imagine students who are moving into you from different areas of the state even, or certainly of the country, kind of becoming experience with what the culture of their current environment is might actually be something that you need to explore. How do we do that? It's really tough. And so I really like the checklist approach. I'm a checklist person. Not because they're exhaustive. So I don't want you to mistake what I'm saying. I don't think that these checklists are exhaustive at all, but I do think they provide us with a start in our thinking. So what I'm showing you here now is a snapshot of a tool that I use in my training with school psychs often. This comes from Idaho, and I've actually put this in the resource folder in box. But it's an exclusionary factors worksheet, and it's really a guidance document to help us as psychs and as multidisciplinary team members think through what things do we need to consider as we're trying to rule things out. So here what you see here is the chart represents some of the prompting questions that we might consider as we determine the impact of culture on a student's learning. And again, while these charts are not exhaustive, I think they do provide a universal structure for assessing these factors in ways that can easily be summarized in an evaluation report. Using something like this helps to ensure consistent evaluation practices. Again, you might find that you need to add to this list, and that's okay. I'm just suggesting here that you determine a process for really thoughtfully exploring the role of exclusionary factors such as culture. The next exclusionary factor that I want to talk to you about is that of environmental and economic disadvantage. And related to this area, I encourage teams to reflect on the ways economic or environmental factors might be impacting the student's performance at school. So notice that that's a really different question than a closed-ended question. Does economic or environmental factors impact a student's performance? I guess do those factors impact? I'm making this distinction because I think that you want to look for evidence that we might otherwise not observe. Again, back to my example, unless someone just told me about some extraneous circumstances that would lead me to think, I'm dealing with an exclusionary factor here, I didn't go seeking those things. But I'm not sure that that's the right approach. So I'm just trying to share my experience and what I might do differently if I was still practicing every day today. I think what's best for kids is that we look for the evidence that might indicate that there's something that we need to dig deeper around. So economic disadvantage can impact school performance, and this might include the inability of a family to really have the resources to afford things that are necessary for learning, so learning materials or even experiences. Additionally, environmental disadvantages can also impact school performance. So these factors can interfere with a student's ability to develop, things like study habits or participate in school-related activities. I also think, and I'm happy that schools are becoming more aware of this, but disruptions in family life and stress and trauma, all those things, even lack of emotional support, should really be explored as we are making decisions about the influence of these exclusionary factors. So again, to support you, here's a checklist. Again, non-exhaustive. You might add additional questions to consider, but here's a place to start. And as you're thinking about, using something like this checklist or developing one in your district, one thing I might share with you, as people use checklists, our natural tendency is to say, okay, well, how many yeses do I need in order for that to be, an exclusionary factor? Well, it doesn't really work like that. You really have to think about the significance of that factor, right? So it's not like if you have 3 yeses that then the student can't be determined to be SLD. This is more of a conversation generator, not an absolute set of criteria that you would use to say, oh, can't be SLD. It's really a way for you to explore other things that you need to look at related to these factors. All right, and then moving on to that exclusionary factor of language proficiency. Districts should identify standard procedures for exploring the influence of a student's language on academic achievement. Now, Article 7 does not give directives on the best approach for doing this, but in this section, I'd like to highlight the framework developed by Ortiz and colleagues because I found this approach to really support the use of consistent practices for practitioners. This approach supports conversations not only about language, but also about culture. So the process that I'm talking about, again, developed by Ortiz and colleagues, is the Culture Language Interpretive Matrix, is what we call the CLIM. And the CLIM was designed to answer the question, is the performance of this student a reflection of ability or a reflection of cultural and linguistic difference? So the results of an individual's CLIM can be interpreted by observing the alignment between the student's performance with the expected pattern of performance. And really what we can see are 3 specific patterns emerge. So either we can see, wow, that yes, culture is impacting the student's performance, and it seems to be just a dimension of culture, or we can see the impact of language, or in some cases we might see both. How do we do this? Well, here's an example that comes from the Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment book by Flanagan and Ortiz. So when we talk about these patterns, you can see these blue lines here. The effect of cultural loading only is observed by interpreting a student's assessment results in the vertical pattern, right? So top down. If we're looking at the impact of language, then we're going to look horizontal from left to right. And if we want to know, well, what is the influence of both culture and language, then we're going to look diagonally from corner to corner. So on this webinar, it wasn't my intention to provide lots of instruction on how to use the CLIM, although if you feel like this is an area that your school psychs and other evaluation team members need more knowledge around, then I want you to reach out to me or the Equity Project folks or even Kristen to let us know that, and we can do that. Here, again, I'm just highlighting this as a best practice that I think you should consider as you're trying to discern whether or not language is an exclusionary factor. So I dug in my crate of old things. I'm a hoarder, kind of. So I found one of the CLIMs that I did way back in the day. This is a 3rd grade student that I tested using the CLIM. And again, my purpose on using this was to help me discern whether or not the student's performance was being influenced by their culture and or language. So as shown here, the student scores decrease as the degree of cultural loading increases. Again, so you should be looking from top to bottom. So in that first column, there is not a lot of culturally related content, and so the student demonstrated average performance. But if I go down that column, when things had to do with lots of when knowledge around specific cultural things was included in the assessment, then the student's performance decreased, right? Not outside the normative range, but still a decrease. The same pattern occurs as I gave the student test questions that required more linguistic skills. So looking, across the page now, again, as I go from left to right, the student's performance decreases as language demands become stronger. And finally, looking diagonally, the student performed best on tasks that were low in things related to culture and language, but the student performed worse on tasks that were highly culturally loaded and required lots of linguistic demand. So what does that mean? Well, this means that the results are invalid. And that word always tripped me up. I know that to me, that word seems out of place. But according to Ortiz, if the student's pattern follows the expected pattern, right, that expected pattern that we just looked at here, right, that diagonal pattern is the expected pattern. So he says if the student's pattern follows the expected pattern, the results are invalid. And that reflects that the primary contribution of the student's performance is that of culture and language. But if the student's performance does not follow that expected pattern, for example, let's say the scores are lower than expected, even in the absence of linguistic and cultural demands, if the student's performance is not following that pattern, then the results, he says, are valid, and that culture and language differences are not the primary factor, right? So, again, you can rule those out. So I strongly encourage you all to use the CLIM in your processes for ruling out language proficiency as an exclusionary factor. And, again, I would be happy to provide your assessment team with more guidance on this area if you feel that's needed. So we've just covered two kind of big areas, so I want to take some time to pause now, and I'd like for you as a team to discuss the two practices that we've just reviewed. So I talked about monitoring the effectiveness of the RTI process. How will you do that? How do you make sure that that process is benefiting all kids equally? Are you collecting and analyzing that data? And then I also want you to think about assessing the influence of those exclusionary factors. Are you using checklists? Might you want to? So as you think about those two practices, think about what strengths you can identify and what your opportunities for growth are. And as you think about opportunities for growth, think about those as things that you can address in your corrective action plans that are going to be due to the department here soon. So take some time. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to talk about this. Again, share your questions in the conversation window. And if you could, let me know when it's close to our 10 minutes. I want you to identify just at least one thing that you are going to consider or you see as an opportunity for growth related to either one of those practices. So it's there, everyone. I got disconnected briefly, but luckily I was still able to see the things that you posted in the conversation window. So lots of good thinking. Great. I will certainly look into sharing some additional resources around the CLIM, and would be glad to support your thinking around culturally responsive practices or developing checklists to evaluate those exclusionary factors. Good thoughts. Okay, well, let's wrap up our discussion this morning with the concept of supporting students who move in to our districts. So we've all heard this concern. I just kind of chuckle at that because that's a factor we have to deal with. But many districts suggest that they are experiencing disproportionality because of the numbers of students that move into their districts already identified as students with specific learning disabilities. And from my perspective, actually, these are difficult situations to address. Our ultimate goal must be to do the right thing for students. I think most of us would agree on that. And we can really only know what the right thing to do is if we're certain that we have procedures in place to review the evaluation history of our students. So we really need to be certain that they are appropriately identified. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. So there are really three specific practices that I have seen be effective as we seek to support, as I have supported districts with their concerns around move-ins. First, I think you really want to establish procedures for reviewing the files of students who move in. Again, back to my love of checklists. You can do this through a checklist. I've seen districts take different approaches, but again, largely it's really based on this idea of digging deeply into the evaluation history. So here is an example of a checklist that you might use. Again, this is up in the box folder that you can access. But notice the last column cites the Article 7 requirement related to SLD. Given that requirement, then the job of whoever is reviewing the file, they're charged with then looking at the student's file and determining whether or not there is support for that criteria, or whether or not the criteria was sufficiently addressed in the evaluation. And so notice the first column asks whether or not there's evidence to support that in the file, yes or no, and then according to whatever decision you make, you write your documentation of those components. This is a very similar process that is used in the file review process at the state level to determine noncompliance in general. So understanding this process and practicing it with your own students in a proactive way could really be a beneficial strategy for you as you seek to remediate disproportionality. I think I'm going to bypass giving you some reflection time here, but because I really think you need to dig into the checklist itself, and you probably have to download that and really look at how it's set up. But I do want you to do that, and when you do that, I want you to discuss your current approaches for reviewing the records of your move-in students. It doesn't matter the eligibility. Of course, you want to think about, given your area of noncompliance, how you're reviewing the records of students who move in with SLD. But in general, what's your practice for assessing the files of move-in students? And when you think about that process, consider what strengths, again, you can identify, and what are your opportunities for growth? Are you using this kind of checklist approach? And again, just like with the exclusionary factors checklist, you should be setting yourself some criteria, right? So if you have X amount of no's that come up on the file review, then that might be the impetus for doing some further evaluation or a reevaluation of that student. What I would say is that it's probably beyond anyone's capacity to reevaluate every single move-in student, but what you should be doing is at a minimum, just making sure that the data that you have on that student supports how you're servicing the student in your district. I want to go back to the previous slide here to think about not only just reviewing the SLD, checklist for file reviews, but again, as I just mentioned, any time that or after doing that process and you notice that there's some inconsistencies, make sure that you have specific benchmarks for when you're going to do a reevaluation. That should be explicitly stated in written procedures. And then additionally, if you notice lots of inconsistencies that prompt the need for a reevaluation, I encourage you to begin an RTI process with that student. Again, that's when appropriate, but particularly related to SLD. If you're noticing that that the evaluation history doesn't match the standards that you would normally do as a part of an initial evaluation, and so you're thinking about reevaluating the student, I would immediately begin an RTI process with that student so that you have documentation of their student's response to quality, scientifically based interventions. Why do that? Well, one of the things that we often struggle with move-ins is changing eligibility or disqualifying students from special education services. So if we're going to go that approach, I think that's, if a student does not meet the criteria for a disability, they shouldn't be labeled with a disability. However, we all know that once a student is identified as a student with a disability, there's a whole network of resources that follow that student. And so just taking those away without any other systems of support probably isn't the most ethical thing for us to do. Again, engaging in an immediate RTI process could be a strategy that would help you navigate that slippery slope there. Again, so those three practices are things you should think about, in my view, as you try to support move-in students. Again, think about what your strengths are in that process and where you might grow. So let me just wrap up our time this morning with a discussion of your next steps. So here shortly, you're going to have to be starting to finalize your corrective action plan. If you want feedback on that, feel free to send it to me, and I'll share my ideas around it. But your major to-dos are to develop kind of a schedule for continuing to talk through the things that we've discussed today, particularly those things that you've identified as opportunities for growth. And again, you should be starting to, if you haven't already, really put together your corrective action plan that will be due to the department by April 10th. Now that you've completed that initial webinar, webinar 1, if you weren't live on the session, then you should go and visit the recording. But now that you've completed both of your assigned webinars, then you can go ahead and start finalizing that corrective action plan. And again, I'm happy to support you with finalizing that. For additional support, again, the Disproportionality monitoring website is in development now, and we'll let you know when it goes live, but it's going to be chock full of lots of resources for you. All the things that I've currently put in the box folder will be moved over to that website in addition to many, many other resources, so stay on the lookout for that. As always, you can, to contact Kristen if you need her, or me, or anyone at the Equity Project to support your needs or answer specific questions. So my last request from you is for you to complete an evaluation of our session today. So if you just, again, click on that link, it'll take you right to SurveyMonkey, where I'd love your honest feedback of our session today. I hope it was helpful as you consider how you are going to address this area of noncompliance related to specific learning disabilities. So that's the end of my talk. I will hang out on the line for a few more minutes. If you have specific questions for me, I'd be happy to chat with you about it.